In 1910, one of Scotland Yard's most senior officials made an extraordinary admission. Sir Robert Anderson, the man who had overseen the entire investigation into the Whitechapel horrors, declared in his memoirs that the police had always known who was responsible. The case, he insisted, was never truly unsolved. If this is true, it raises a deeply troubling question. Why has the perpetrator's name been officially suppressed for over 136 years? Was there a deliberate cover-up? Did powerful forces within Victorian society conspire to bury the truth? And if so, why? For more than a century, researchers dismissed Anderson's claim as the boastful ramblings of a retired policeman. But recently, the convergence of evidence has changed everything. DNA analysis conducted on items allegedly recovered from a crime scene, century-old police documents discovered hidden in private collections, overlooked asylum records that place a prime suspect within walking distance of every location where a body was found. Together, these discoveries have brought investigators closer to a definitive answer than at any point in history. Yet, the closer we get, the more questions emerge. Because what the evidence reveals is not simply the identity of a killer. It exposes a web of contradictions, institutional failures, and decisions made at the highest levels of law enforcement that ensured this case would never be officially closed. Tonight, we examine every major suspect. We weigh the evidence for and against each one. And we confront the uncomfortable possibility that the truth was known all along and deliberately hidden. If unsolved mysteries and hidden histories fascinate you, consider subscribing to this channel, because what we are about to uncover may finally put a name to the most infamous unknown figure in criminal history. In the autumn of 1888, the Whitechapel district of London's East End was one of the most dangerous places in the British Empire. Overcrowded lodging houses crammed dozens of people into single rooms. Poverty was so widespread that thousands of women had no choice but to sell themselves on the streets simply to afford a bed for the night. The narrow alleys were unlit, the police presence stretched thin, and violence was so commonplace that it rarely made the newspapers. But what happened between the end of August and the beginning of November that year was something altogether different. Something that would grip the entire nation in fear and transform this impoverished corner of London into the most notorious crime scene in history. The first victim was Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends as Polly. In the early hours of the 31st of August, her body was discovered in a gateway on Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut so deeply that the blade had reached the vertebrae. But it was what the examining physician found at the mortuary that truly shocked investigators. Her abdomen had been ripped open with a long, jagged wound. Her intestines were exposed. Whoever had done this possessed a level of ferocity and quite possibly anatomical knowledge that defied explanation. Just 8 days later, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a lodging house on Hanbury Street. This time, the savagery had escalated. Her throat had been severed in the same manner as Nichols, but the killer had gone further. Her abdomen had been entirely laid open, and her uterus had been removed and taken away. The physician who examined her believed the extraction had been performed with some degree of skill, leading to immediate speculation that the perpetrator might have medical training. The city was now gripped by panic. Newspapers ran lurid headlines, vigilance committees formed in the East End, residents were afraid to walk the streets after dark. And then, on the 30th of September, the horror reached its peak. That night would become known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish-born woman who had fallen on hard times, was found in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street. Her throat had been cut, but unusually, her body showed no further mutilation. Investigators theorized that the killer had been interrupted, perhaps by the approach of a cart entering the yard, and had fled before completing his work. But he was not finished.
Less than an hour later, and barely half a mile away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square. This time, there had been no interruption. Her throat was slashed, her face had been savagely disfigured, with cuts to her cheeks, eyelids, and nose. Her abdomen had been ripped open, and the killer had removed both her uterus and her left kidney, taking them with him when he vanished into the night. 2 women, 1 hour. The message was unmistakable. This was not random violence. This was something calculated, driven by compulsions that no one in Victorian England fully understood. For 5 weeks after the double event, an uneasy silence fell over Whitechapel. Some dared to hope the perpetrator had fled or perhaps taken his own life. Those hopes were shattered on the 9th of November. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the victims, only 25 years old. Unlike the others, she was not found on the street. She was discovered in her own room, a small dwelling in Miller's Court off Dorset Street. What the police found when they finally broke down her door was so extreme that hardened detectives struggled to describe it. Kelly had been almost entirely dismembered. Her face was unrecognizable, her organs had been removed and arranged around the room, her heart was missing entirely and was never recovered. The level of destruction suggested the killer had spent hours with her body, undisturbed, in a frenzy that defied comprehension. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the killings stopped. No more bodies appeared bearing the distinctive wounds. No more women were found with their throats cut and their organs removed. The figure that the press had dubbed Jack the Ripper, a name taken from a taunting letter sent to a news agency, had vanished. But the police had not given up. Far from it. Behind the scenes, investigators believed they were closing in on their man. Senior officers were privately convinced they knew exactly who was responsible. What happened next would become one of the greatest buried secrets in the history of British law enforcement.
The investigation into the Whitechapel horrors was the largest and most intensive that London had ever seen. Hundreds of officers were deployed to the East End. Thousands of individuals were questioned. House-to-house searches were conducted across the district, with investigators examining every man whose circumstances allowed him to come and go without arousing suspicion. Butchers, slaughtermen, and anyone with access to surgical instruments came under immediate scrutiny. The distinctive nature of the wounds, the precise removal of organs, the speed with which the attacks were carried out, convinced many officers that they were hunting someone with anatomical knowledge. Whether that meant a doctor, a medical student, or simply someone who had worked in a slaughterhouse remained a matter of debate. At the head of the investigation stood 3 men whose names would become permanently linked to the case. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline was the officer on the ground, pounding the streets of Whitechapel and conducting interviews with anyone who might have seen something. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was appointed by the Commissioner to coordinate all incoming information from Scotland Yard. And overseeing everything was Sir Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and head of the Criminal Investigation Department. It was Anderson who would later make the most explosive claims about the case. But at the time of the killings, he was largely absent. He had departed for a holiday in Switzerland just days after the first incidents, leaving his subordinates to manage the crisis. By the time he returned in early October, 3 more women had lost their lives. Despite the enormous effort, no arrest was ever made. The press savaged the police for their failures. Public confidence collapsed. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, resigned in the immediate aftermath of the Kelly atrocity. To the outside world, the investigation appeared to be a catastrophic failure. But behind closed doors, a very different picture was emerging. Years after the killings had ceased, documents began to surface that suggested the police had identified a suspect and had chosen not to act.
The first of these documents came to light in 1959 when a television journalist named Dan Farson discovered a memorandum written by Sir Melville Macnaghten, who had joined the Metropolitan Police in 1889 and later rose to become Assistant Chief Constable. The memorandum had been written in 1894, 6 years after the final canonical slaying. Its purpose was to refute claims made by a newspaper that a man named Thomas Cutbush was the Whitechapel perpetrator. In dismissing Cutbush, Macnaghten named 3 other men whom he considered far more likely candidates.
The first was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose body had been pulled from the River Thames in late December 1888. The second was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con-man whom Macnaghten described as a homicidal maniac. The third was identified only as Kosminski, a Polish Jew who, according to Macnaghten, had a great hatred of women and had been committed to an asylum. Of the 3, Macnaghten appeared to favor Druitt, but it was the third name, Kosminski, that would prove the most significant, because Kosminski was also the suspect named by the 2 most senior officers who had actually worked the case. In 1910, Sir Robert Anderson published his memoirs. Within them, he made an astonishing claim. The perpetrator, he wrote, had been identified. A witness had seen the man with one of the victims shortly before her body was found. This witness had been brought to a location where the suspect was presented to him, and he had positively identified the man as the individual he had seen that night. But there was a complication. According to Anderson, both the witness and the suspect were Polish Jews, and the witness, unwilling to give evidence against a fellow Jew, had refused to testify. Without that testimony, the police could not prosecute. The suspect was instead committed to an asylum, where Anderson implied he remained for the rest of his life. Anderson did not name the suspect directly, but after his death, his personal copy of the memoirs passed to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the very man who had coordinated the entire investigation from Scotland Yard. And in the margins of that book, Swanson had written notes that confirmed what Anderson had only hinted at. The suspect, Swanson wrote, was Kosminski. Swanson added further details. Kosminski had been watched by police at his brother's residence in Whitechapel. He had later been taken with his hands tied behind his back to the workhouse and then to an asylum, and there, Swanson noted, he had died shortly afterwards. Here at last, it seemed, was the truth. 2 of the most senior officers connected to the investigation had independently named the same man. The police knew who was responsible. They had identified him, surveilled him, and ultimately ensured he was locked away where he could harm no one else. The case was solved. It had simply never been publicly acknowledged. But there was a problem, a significant one. Macnaghten's memorandum contained numerous errors. He described Druitt as a 41-year-old doctor when he was in fact a 31-year-old barrister. He stated that Kosminski had been committed to an asylum around March 1889 and had died shortly thereafter. And yet, when researchers finally traced the man believed to be the suspect, a Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski, they discovered he had not died in 1889. He had lived until 1919, spending nearly 3 decades confined to various institutions. Even more troubling was a direct contradiction between the accounts. Anderson and Swanson claimed a witness had positively identified the suspect, but Macnaghten, writing just 4 years after the final slaying, stated plainly that no one had ever seen the Whitechapel perpetrator. Both statements could not be true.
Either a witness had identified the killer and the police knew exactly who he was, or no such identification had ever occurred, and the claims of Anderson and Swanson were exaggeration, misremembering, or something worse. For decades, researchers could not resolve this contradiction. The official files remained sealed or incomplete. Key documents had vanished from police archives. The truth, it seemed, had been deliberately obscured. And then, in 1987, a researcher made a discovery that would reignite the entire debate.
For nearly a century, the name Kosminski appeared in police documents without a first name attached. Macnaghten had referred only to a Polish Jew called Kosminski. Anderson had described a low-class immigrant. Swanson had scribbled the surname in the margins of a book. But no one had ever definitively identified which Kosminski the police had suspected. That changed in 1987 when author and researcher Martin Fido began systematically searching through Victorian asylum records. His goal was simple: to find any patient named Kosminski who matched the descriptions provided by the senior officers. What he discovered would transform the investigation. In the archives of Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, Fido found only one individual whose name and circumstances aligned with the police accounts. His name was Aaron Kosminski, and his life story placed him at the very heart of the Whitechapel district during the Autumn of Terror. Aaron Kosminski was born in 1865 in the town of Klodawa in what was then part of the Russian Empire's Polish territories. His family were Jewish and, like thousands of others fleeing persecution and poverty in Eastern Europe, they emigrated to England in the early 1880s. Aaron arrived in London as a teenager and settled in the East End, where he found work as a hairdresser. By 1888, Kosminski was living either on Providence Street or Greenfield Street, both addresses located within walking distance of every site where a body was discovered. He was a young man in his burly 20s, familiar with the labyrinthine alleyways of Whitechapel and part of the immigrant community that populated the district. But there was another dimension to Aaron Kosminski's life. By the late 1880s, he had begun displaying signs of severe mental disturbance. According to records from the asylum, Kosminski suffered from auditory hallucinations. He believed he was guided by an instinct that told him what to do. He refused to eat food prepared by others, convinced it had been poisoned, and instead scavenged scraps from the gutter. He neglected his personal hygiene to an extreme degree, and he engaged in what Victorian physicians delicately termed solitary vices, a phrase that matched Macnaghten's description of the suspect almost exactly. Most significantly, asylum records noted that Kosminski harbored a profound hostility toward women. In 1891, Kosminski's behavior escalated to the point where his family could no longer manage him. He threatened his sister with a knife, an incident serious enough to warrant police intervention. He was taken first to the Mile End Old Town Workhouse and then committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, where physicians diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia.
The timing aligned remarkably well with the police accounts. Anderson and Swanson had described a suspect who was placed under surveillance before eventually being confined to an institution. Kosminski's admission to the workhouse in 1890, followed by his transfer to the asylum in 1891, matched this sequence of events. Furthermore, the nature of his illness corresponded with what modern criminal psychologists might expect from such a perpetrator. Paranoid schizophrenia, with its hallucinations and delusions, could explain both the frenzied nature of the attacks and the apparent cessation of violence once the individual was institutionalized. But the case against Aaron Kosminski was far from airtight. The asylum records consistently described him as harmless. Despite his initial threatening behavior toward his sister, Kosminski showed little violence during his decades of confinement. The only recorded incident involved him brandishing a chair at an attendant in 1892, hardly the behavior of a man capable of the systematic brutality witnessed in Whitechapel. There was also the question of language. Kosminski spoke primarily Yiddish and appeared to have limited command of English. The Whitechapel victims, though poor and vulnerable, would have needed to communicate with their attacker in the moments before the assaults. Could a man who struggled with the language have lured them into dark alleyways and secluded courtyards? Perhaps most damaging to the police narrative was the discrepancy in Kosminski's date of passing. Swanson had noted in his marginalia that the suspect died shortly after being committed to the asylum, but Aaron Kosminski did not pass away until 1919, 28 years after his institutionalization. He succumbed to gangrene of the leg at Leavesden Asylum, having spent nearly 3 decades confined to various institutions. Either Swanson's memory had failed him, or he was referring to a different individual entirely. Researchers have proposed alternative candidates. Martin Fido himself suggested that the police may have confused Kosminski with another patient, a man admitted under the name David Cohen, who was violently insane and did die shortly after his commitment. Cohen, Fido argued, might have been the true suspect, with his identity later conflated with Kosminski's in the memories of aging officers. Others have argued that the identification itself may never have occurred as Anderson described. Perhaps the witness had expressed only vague recognition. Perhaps the entire account was embellished over time, shaped by the desire of retired policemen to claim they had solved the most famous case of their careers. For over a century, the debate remained at an impasse. The documentary evidence pointed toward Kosminski, but it was riddled with inconsistencies. There was no physical proof connecting him to the crimes, no forensic evidence that could confirm or refute his involvement. And then, in 2007, a businessman walked into an auction house and purchased a stained silk shawl. What he claimed to have found would make headlines around the world and ignite a controversy that continues to this day.
Russell Edwards was not a professional historian or a forensic scientist. He was a businessman with a passion for the Whitechapel case, one of thousands of amateur enthusiasts who had spent years poring over the available evidence. But in 2007, he made a purchase that he believed would finally resolve the mystery that had confounded researchers for over a century. At an auction in Bury St. Edmunds, Edwards acquired a large silk shawl, its fabric stained with what appeared to be old blood. The provenance provided by the seller told a remarkable story. According to family tradition, the shawl had been recovered from Mitre Square on the night Catherine Eddowes was slain. A Metropolitan Police officer named Amos Simpson had supposedly taken it from the scene and brought it home as a gift for his wife. She had been so horrified by the bloodstains that she had never worn it, and the garment had been passed down through generations, eventually reaching the auction block. If the story was true, Edwards had in his possession the only surviving physical evidence from any of the canonical crime scenes. And if that evidence could be tested using modern forensic techniques, it might finally answer the question that had haunted researchers for over 100 years. Edwards contacted Dr. Jerry Loalainen, a biochemist at Liverpool John Moores University who specialized in the analysis of historic DNA. Loalainen agreed to examine the shawl, extracting whatever genetic material might have survived after more than a century. The results, Edwards claimed, were extraordinary.
Using a technique called vacuuming extraction, Louhelainen recovered fragments of mitochondrial DNA from stains on the fabric. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, making it possible to trace ancestry across many generations. If DNA from the shawl could be matched to living descendants of individuals connected to the case, it would provide powerful evidence of authenticity. Edwards tracked down Karen Miller, a woman who could trace her lineage directly back to Catherine Eddowes through an unbroken female line. A sample of Miller's DNA was compared against the genetic material recovered from what appeared to be bloodstains on the shawl. According to Louhelainen, the mitochondrial DNA matched. But the blood was only half the equation. The shawl also bore stains that appeared to be of a different origin, stains that Louhelainen believed were consistent with semen. If DNA could be recovered from these stains and matched to a suspect, it would represent the first forensic evidence ever linking an individual to the Whitechapel atrocities. Edwards located a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. Since Kosminski himself had never fathered children, a direct descendant was impossible to find. But mitochondrial DNA passes through the female line regardless of whether any given individual reproduced, meaning a sister's descendants would share the same maternal lineage. When the DNA from the suspected semen stains was compared against the sample from Kosminski's relative, Louhelainen reported a match. The first test showed a 99.2% correlation. A second test on a complementary strand of DNA, according to Edwards, produced a perfect 100% match.
In 2014, Edwards published his findings in a book titled Naming Jack the Ripper. His conclusion was unequivocal. Aaron Kosminski, he declared, was definitely, categorically, and absolutely the perpetrator of the Whitechapel horrors. The case, after 126 years, was finally solved. The media response was overwhelming. Headlines around the world proclaimed that the mystery had been cracked. Television programs revisited the case with renewed energy. For a brief moment, it appeared that the most famous unsolved crime in history had at last been laid to rest. But almost immediately, serious questions began to emerge. The first problem concerned the shawl itself. Despite Edwards's claims, there was no documentary evidence that the garment had ever been present at the crime scene. The official police inventory from Mitre Square made no mention of a silk shawl. Catherine Eddowes had been a destitute woman, homeless and penniless on the night of her passing. The idea that she would have possessed an expensive silk garment and not pawned it for food or lodging struck many researchers as implausible. Then there was the matter of Amos Simpson, the officer who had allegedly recovered the shawl. Records confirmed that Simpson was a real person and a serving member of the Metropolitan Police in 1888. But he was stationed with N Division, which covered an area miles from Whitechapel. The Eddowes scene was in Mitre Square, which fell under the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, an entirely separate force. Simpson had no documented reason to be anywhere near the crime scene that night. Furthermore, the shawl had spent over a century in private hands. It had been handled by family members, displayed to researchers, and passed through an auction house before reaching Edwards. The opportunities for contamination were immense. Any DNA recovered from the fabric might have come not from 1888, but from decades of subsequent contact. The scientific community proved equally skeptical. When Louhelainen and his colleague, Dr. David Miller, finally published their findings in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, 5 years after Edwards's book, geneticists immediately identified problems with the methodology. The key issue concerned a specific genetic marker that Edwards and Louhelainen had claimed was exceptionally rare.
They identified a sequence variation called 314.1c and argued that it was so uncommon it could only belong to a tiny fraction of the global population. This rarity, they suggested, made the match to Eddowes's descendants statistically significant. But other scientists quickly pointed out that the researchers had made a nomenclature error. The marker they had identified was not 314.1c, but 314.5c, a variation so common that it appears in more than 99% of people with European ancestry. The supposedly rare genetic signature was, in fact, almost universal. Researchers at Innsbruck Medical University published a formal criticism of the study, identifying multiple errors and questionable assumptions. The Journal of Forensic Sciences took the unusual step of printing an expression of concern regarding the paper. When the authors were asked to produce their original data for independent verification, they were unable to do so. The DNA evidence, once hailed as conclusive proof, had collapsed under scientific scrutiny. Even if the methodology had been sound, critics noted that DNA is inherently limited as an identification tool. Because it passes unchanged through the maternal line, thousands of people alive in 1888 would have shared the same mitochondrial signature. Proving that DNA on the shawl matched his lineage did not prove he had left it there, only that someone from a very large pool of individuals with similar ancestry might have done so. Edwards has continued to champion his findings. In recent years, he has sought legal permission to exhume Kosminski's remains for further testing and petitioned for a formal inquest that would officially name Kosminski as the perpetrator. Karen Miller, the descendant of Catherine Eddowes, has supported these efforts, expressing a desire to see justice finally delivered for her ancestor. But among historians and forensic scientists, the consensus remains deeply skeptical. The shawl cannot be definitively linked to the crime scene. The DNA evidence is fatally compromised, and the fundamental question remains unanswered. If Kosminski cannot be proven guilty through forensic evidence, the case must rest on the documentary record alone. And that record, as we have seen, is riddled with contradictions and errors. Perhaps, then, the answer lies elsewhere. Perhaps the police were wrong about Kosminski. Perhaps the true perpetrator was someone else entirely. Someone's name appeared in the official files but was dismissed too hastily. It is time to examine the other suspects.
Aaron Kosminski may have been the favored suspect of Anderson and Swanson, but he was not the only name in the police files. McNaughton's memorandum had listed 3 individuals, and over the decades that followed, researchers proposed dozens more. Some were plausible candidates backed by circumstantial evidence, others were sensational accusations with little foundation. To understand why the case remains officially unsolved, we must examine the most significant alternatives and ask whether any of them might have been dismissed too quickly. Montague John Druitt. Of all the suspects named in contemporary police documents, Montague John Druitt held a special place in McNaughton's estimation. In his memorandum, McNaughton described Druitt as the most likely of the 3 candidates and implied that his own family had suspected him of the crimes. Druitt was born in 1857 into a respectable family in Dorset. His father was a prominent surgeon, and Montague followed a conventional path for a young man of his class, attending Winchester College before studying law at Oxford. By 1888, he was working as a barrister while supplementing his income as an assistant schoolmaster at a boarding school in Blackheath, south of the Thames. On the surface, Druitt seemed an unlikely candidate. He was educated, middle class, and lived miles from the impoverished streets of Whitechapel. But there were darker currents beneath the respectable exterior.
Mental illness ran through the Druitt family. His mother had attempted to take her own life before being committed to an asylum where she would remain until her passing. Her grandmother had ended her own life. Her sister would later do the same. And in late November 1888, just weeks after the final canonical slaying, Montague John Druitt was dismissed from his teaching position under circumstances that remain unclear. On the 31st of December, his body was pulled from the River Thames near Chiswick. He had filled his pockets with stones. A note found among his possessions read, "Since Friday, I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die." The timing seemed almost too convenient. The most savage of the Whitechapel atrocities had occurred on the 9th of November. Druitt was dead by early December. If he had been the perpetrator, his suicide would explain why the killings had suddenly ceased. Macnaghten certainly thought so. He wrote that the perpetrator's brain had given way altogether after the final atrocity, driving him to end his own life. The case, in Macnaghten's view, was closed. The killer had perished before he could be apprehended. But the evidence against Druitt crumbles under scrutiny.
Macnaghten's memorandum contains fundamental errors about the basic facts of Druitt's life. He described him as a 41-year-old doctor when Druitt was in fact a 31-year-old barrister. He claimed Druitt had disappeared immediately after the Kelly slaying, when records show he was actively pursuing his legal career in the weeks that followed. He was even playing cricket in Dorset the day after the first canonical victim was discovered, hardly the behavior of a man who had committed a frenzied attack in London just hours earlier. More damaging still is the geography. Druitt lived in Blackheath, on the opposite side of the Thames from Whitechapel. Most researchers now believe the perpetrator was someone intimately familiar with the East End's maze of alleyways and courtyards, a local resident who could navigate the streets in darkness and vanish into the crowds. Druitt, a middle-class professional from South London, does not fit this profile. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the detective who had walked those streets night after night during the Autumn of Terror, dismissed Druitt entirely. In a newspaper interview years later, Aberline stated there was nothing to implicate him beyond the timing of his suicide. And what of Macnaghten's claim that Druitt's own family suspected him? The phrasing is revealing. Macnaghten does not say the family had evidence, he says only that they had suspicions. No member of the Druitt family ever came forward to confirm this. No documents have ever surfaced to support it. The entire claim may be nothing more than rumor, repeated and embellished over time. Montague John Druitt was a troubled man who ended his own life during a period of personal crisis. That his suicide coincided with the end of the Whitechapel horrors appears to be nothing more than coincidence. Michael Ostrog. The second name in Macnaghten's memorandum was Michael Ostrog, described as a Russian doctor and convict who had been detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. Ostrog was a real person, though virtually nothing Macnaghten wrote about him was accurate. He was not a doctor. He was a professional conman who used dozens of aliases and frequently claimed qualifications he did not possess. His criminal record was extensive, but it consisted almost entirely of fraud and theft. There is no documented evidence that he ever committed an act of violence against another person. More conclusively, researcher Philip Sugden discovered prison records proving that Ostrog was incarcerated in France during the autumn of 1888. He was physically incapable of committing the Whitechapel atrocities because he was behind bars in another country when they occurred. Why Macnaghten included him on the list remains a mystery. Perhaps he was working from incomplete information. Perhaps Ostrog's reputation as a cunning and elusive criminal made him seem like a plausible candidate on paper. Whatever the reason, he can be definitively excluded as a suspect. In 1913, a letter emerged that added a new name to the list of credible suspects. Chief Inspector John Littlechild, who had headed the special branch during the period of the Whitechapel crimes, wrote to a journalist mentioning an individual he considered a very likely candidate, an American quack doctor named Francis Tumblety. Tumblety was a flamboyant and deeply unsettling figure. Born in Ireland around 1833, he had emigrated to America as a child and spent decades traveling across the United States and Canada posing as an Indian herb doctor and selling dubious remedies to gullible customers. He dressed extravagantly, often in military-style uniforms, and cultivated an air of mystery and importance. But beneath the showmanship lay something darker. Tumblety was a known misogynist who made no secret of his hatred for women. At a dinner party in Washington, he reportedly displayed a collection of preserved uteri in glass jars, boasting that they had come from every class of woman. His hostility toward the female sex was so pronounced that acquaintances remarked upon it years later. In 1888, Tumblety was in London. On the 7th of November, 2 days before the Kelly atrocity, he was arrested on charges of gross indecency, the Victorian legal term for homosexual acts. Released on bail, he fled the country before his trial, traveling first to France and then back to America. American newspapers reported that Scotland Yard had sent officers across the Atlantic to apprehend him in connection with the Whitechapel crimes. The Metropolitan Police never confirmed this, and no extradition was ever attempted. Tumblety died in St. Louis in 1903, his possible connection to the case largely forgotten until Littlechild's letter resurfaced decades later. There are reasons to take Tumblety seriously. His documented hatred of women, his possession of preserved organs, and his presence in London during the relevant period all raise troubling questions. Littlechild, unlike McNathan, had actually been serving in the police during the autumn of 1888 and would have had access to intelligence about suspects. But there are equally compelling reasons for doubt. Tumblety was a conspicuous figure, tall, flamboyantly dressed, with an elaborate moustache that would have made him instantly memorable. Eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the perpetrator consistently described an ordinary-looking man of medium height, someone who could blend into a crowd and disappear without attracting notice. Tumblety could not have been less suited to moving undetected through the streets of Whitechapel. Furthermore, there is no evidence placing him in the East End on any of the relevant nights. He may have been in London, but London is a vast city. Being present in the capital is not the same as prowling the alleyways of Whitechapel. Tumblety remains an intriguing possibility, but nothing more. Hyam Hyams. In recent years, a new candidate has emerged from the asylum records, one who fits the profile of the Whitechapel perpetrator more closely than any suspect previously considered. Hyam Hyams was a cigar maker born in Aldgate in 1855. Unlike Druitt or Tumblety, he was a genuine East End resident, intimately familiar with the streets where the atrocities occurred. The 1881 census records him living on Mitre Street, just yards from Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes would be discovered 7 years later. Hyams suffered from severe mental illness throughout his adult life. He experienced episodes of violent mania interspersed with periods of apparent normality. His condition deteriorated over time, and by the late 1880s, he had become dangerous. In 1889, he attacked his wife with a knife, the same type of weapon used in the Whitechapel crimes. He was repeatedly institutionalized, and asylum records describe him as crafty and dangerous. Staff noted that he had assaulted other patients and attendants on multiple occasions. The timing of Hyams's confinement aligns intriguingly with the cessation of the Whitechapel horrors. He was detained by police in Lemon Street, Whitechapel, in late December 1888, suffering from delirium tremens. He would spend much of the following decades in various institutions, never again walking freely through the streets where the atrocities had occurred. Researcher Martin Fido first identified Hyams while searching for the suspect named by Anderson. Author Sarah Bax Horton has more recently championed him as the most plausible candidate, arguing that he matches the police descriptions more closely than Aaron Kosminski. But the case against Hyams is also circumstantial. His documented violence was directed primarily at men, asylum staff and fellow patients, rather than women. His delusions centered on paranoid beliefs that other men were having affairs with his wife, not on hatred of women in general, and there is no direct evidence connecting him to any of the crime scenes. Like every other suspect, Hyams remains unproven. The evidence suggests he could have been the perpetrator. It does not prove that he was. And so the mystery persists. Every candidate has elements that seem to fit. Every candidate has problems that cannot be resolved. The police files are incomplete, the witnesses are long gone, and the physical evidence has either been lost or hopelessly contaminated. Perhaps the truth is that investigators have failed to identify the correct suspect. Perhaps the truth is that certainty was never possible, and that those who claimed otherwise were deceiving themselves as much as anyone else. But there is one final question that must be addressed. If the police truly believed they knew who was responsible, why did they never say so publicly? Why was the case never officially closed? The answer may lie not in the evidence, but in the politics of Victorian London. After examining every major suspect, weighing the documentary evidence, and scrutinizing the DNA analysis that promised to solve everything, we are left with an uncomfortable truth. The case remains officially unsolved, not because the evidence does not exist, but because the evidence that does exist points in too many directions at once. The police of 1888 faced an impossible situation. They operated without fingerprinting, without forensic science, without any of the tools that modern investigators take for granted. They relied on witness testimony that was often contradictory and suspect, descriptions that could have matched hundreds of men in the East End. And yet, senior officers repeatedly claimed they knew who was responsible. Anderson insisted the perpetrator had been identified. Swanson named Kosminski in his private notes. MacNaughton pointed toward Druitt. These were not fools or fantasists. They were experienced detectives who had access to files and testimony that no longer survive. So why the silence? Why was no name ever officially announced? The answer may lie in the volatile atmosphere of 1888. The East End was home to thousands of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. Anti-Semitic sentiment was already running high. If the police had publicly accused a Jewish man of the Whitechapel horrors, particularly without sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Riots, pogroms, violence against an entire community based on the actions of one disturbed individual. Perhaps the decision was made at the highest levels to let the matter rest. The suspect was confined to an asylum. He could harm no one else. Public safety had been achieved without inflaming tensions that might have torn the East End apart. If this theory is correct, then the mystery of Jack the Ripper was never a failure of detection. It was a deliberate act of suppression,
a choice made by men who decided that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. We may never know with absolute certainty who committed the Whitechapel atrocities. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are long deceased. The official files are incomplete and contradictory. But perhaps the more important question is not who he was, but who the victims were. For too long, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly have been remembered only as names on a list, footnotes in the story of their own deaths. They were real women, with families, histories, and lives that extended far beyond the terrible manner of their endings. If there is any justice to be found after 136 years, it lies not in naming a perpetrator, but in remembering the women whose lives were taken. They deserve more than to be defined by the man who ended their lives. They deserve to be remembered as human beings. The case of Jack the Ripper has captivated researchers, historians, and armchair detectives for well over a century. New theories continue to emerge. New evidence is periodically claimed. The debate shows no sign of ending. If this story has intrigued you, if you want to explore more mysteries from history that remain unsolved and unresolved, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We examine the cases that others have forgotten, the questions that still demand answers, and the truths that powerful forces have tried to bury. Because some mysteries refuse to stay silent, and some stories are too important to leave untold.